Hi, everyone. So today we are joined again by Dr. Chris Palmer. We actually had the pleasure of having him on the channel about almost a year ago, where he talked about how mental illness is really metabolic disorder. And he talked about how to use the keto diet as an intervention for treating schizophrenia. And so I would really recommend going back to rewatch those videos before watching this video, as they're really helpful to get kind of a baseline of information beforehand. But in this video, we're going to be diving more into the science behind using the keto diet as a metabolic intervention. So just a quick introductory to Dr. Palmer. Dr. Palmer is a board-certified psychiatrist, and he is an assistant professor at the Harvard Medical School. He wrote the book Brain Energy, which I would really recommend checking out. It goes into great detail about mental illness as metabolic dysfunction and using metabolic therapies to treat it. It's really great, and I would recommend checking it out. Something else that is a really interesting thing to note that has happened recently is he actually is starting the metabolic and mental health program at McLean Hospital and Harvard Medical School. Now, this program is going to be a research program that is going to be working with world-renowned researchers who have been pursuing the mitochondrial and metabolic basis of illnesses like bipolar and schizophrenia for over 2 decades now. And another really exciting component of this new program is that they are going to be starting a clinical consultation service. And this is going to be the first in the world that is going to be based in a psychiatric hospital offering metabolic therapies such as the ketogenic diet to patients who are living with mental illness. So I'm very, very excited to see what comes of that. And it's a really exciting new development in the world of metabolic psychiatry that Dr. Palmer is spearheading. So hello, Dr. Palmer. Thank you so much for joining us again today on the channel. I'm so excited to have you here. I've been diving kind of deeper into metabolic health, metabolic psychiatry, and keto and whatnot through this project, obviously. And you are kind of a rock star in the field of metabolic psychiatry. So I'm very, very excited to have you here again and to kind of pick your brain on some of this. So thank you for being here.
Thank you for inviting me and for having me on.
So I guess the first question, and a good place to start off, would just be to get you to kind of give the medical side of things and the scientific explanation of what is the difference between medical keto and regular keto.
So regular keto, there are so many books and websites and random people who are going to tell you how they use keto to lose some weight or to improve some aspect of health. And so that means that there are tons of variations of it. Some people focus on certain types of foods and not others. A lot of times, kind of the loose ketogenic diet can include cakes and pies and processed foods that you get from Costco that have keto on the label. And as long as people are losing weight, nobody really cares too much. If they lose weight, then all right, great. The medical ketogenic diet is much more rigorous, and hopefully it is supervised or overseen by medical professionals such as dietitians or neurologists or psychiatrists or others who are actually using it to treat a medical condition. I didn't include endocrinologists or primary care docs who are using it to treat diabetes, but it is in fact an evidence-based treatment, not just for weight loss, but also for type 2 diabetes and for epilepsy. And in my mind, when people are using it for a really serious health condition, they actually deserve really serious help. It should not be a do-it-yourself project. It shouldn't be something that people just look on the internet, get some information without really understanding the credibility of that information and just hoping for the best. Serious disorders deserve serious treatment.
Yeah. I fell for some of the keto products from Costco and whatnot, but quickly learned that that was not okay on the medical diet. Is there any difference in the amount of carbs that you're allowed to intake with medical keto? And what does that look like with medical keto?
So it can be, and different people are different. And so they will need different levels of macros, essentially, which means different levels of carbohydrates, protein, and fat. And interestingly, people who are really overweight, or if they have obesity, it's actually easier for them to do a medical grade version of the diet early on because they have a lot of fat stores on their body that they can tap into. And so for them, the carbohydrates can sometimes go as high as 50 grams of carbohydrates a day. And just eat all the protein that they want. And they don't necessarily even have to think too much about adding fat to their meals. As long as they restrict carbohydrates, eat adequate protein, they can sometimes be in very high levels of ketosis, which gets the medical benefits for epilepsy or type 2 diabetes or mental health conditions. But when people tend to be thinner, it actually gets a lot more difficult and challenging, unfortunately. And that means that you do have to get much more rigorous about the amount of carbohydrates you're consuming, usually less than 20 grams a day. But it also means that you might need to be adding a lot more fat to your diet than you ever thought humanly possible or advisable. Yeah. So you might be adding butter and heavy cream and olive oil to everything that you're eating. And you might think this is crazy and ridiculous, but that is the medical version of the diet for that person.
Yeah, I'm a little flabbergasted at how much fat I'm needing to consume per day, but yeah, quickly learning that. So in one of the previous videos that we had you on the channel for, you discussed how mental illness is really potentially metabolic dysfunction or metabolic illness. And so can you kind of just give a brief overview of what exactly you mean by metabolic dysfunction? What is that?
So when I think about mental illness, first and foremost, it's really important in my mind that we distinguish between normal human suffering, normal reactions to trauma, stress, adversity, and what I would call a mental disorder, where the brain is actually somewhat malfunctioning, causing symptoms that are highly distressing, but also causing symptoms that are unusual. Most people don't have the symptoms. And the reason that distinction is important is because the treatments and the way even I would describe the problem is very different. The first category, it's obvious and common sense. We all know it. If somebody's being traumatized and they have trauma symptoms or anxiety symptoms or depression, the treatment of choice is to get them out of that traumatic environment and stop the trauma, and that will often solve the problem. If somebody is grieving the loss of a loved one that just passed away 2 days ago, that is normal. They don't have a chemical imbalance. They don't have a brain disorder. It is normal for them to be suffering and grieving and having sometimes serious symptoms of depression. But when we think about what I would call brain disorders, where the brain is doing things that are unusual, that are not in the person's best interest, they're panic attacks for no reason, or hallucinations or delusions, or where the brain is not doing things that it's supposed to be doing, like helping people focus or remember things, that those can all be symptoms of mental illness. And I believe that the root cause of that, a lot of people say, well, maybe it's genetics, or maybe it's neurotransmitter imbalances, or maybe it's hormones. And in fact, yes, all of those things play a role. But if we put them all together, ultimately, the unifying connection between all of those things is that they are metabolic in nature. And what that means is that when any of the cells in your brain or body are metabolically compromised, they can begin to malfunction. And that can sometimes result in brain symptoms that we end up calling a mental illness.
Right. So my understanding of the keto diet is basically that it helps your body to burn fat and create ketones, which are used for fuel for your body and your brain. But I'm wondering what exactly is the benefit of this, and what exactly is happening to mitochondria and metabolic health in your brain when following the keto diet.
So it's a really important question, and still many controversial answers. So researchers have actually been studying the ketogenic diet and how it stops seizures for over 40 years now. And so we actually know a tremendous amount. We have a tremendous amount of science. But as you can imagine, that science gets complicated quickly. And so we know that the ketogenic diet changes neurotransmitters in the brain. It can decrease brain inflammation. It changes the gut microbiome, which might end up affecting the brain through the gut-brain connection. It changes gene expression. And all of those things we know might be critical to playing a role in brain function. And so maybe those are the mechanisms of action. And there are some researchers who are very passionate about one or another of those mechanisms. The mechanism that I am most passionate about is that the ketogenic diet has profound effects on mitochondria. And the two things that it does is it stimulates a process called mitophagy, in which old or defective mitochondria can get replaced or recycled. And it also stimulates a process called mitochondrial biogenesis, in which new mitochondria can be produced. And I believe that almost the definition of a metabolically compromised cell has to include compromised mitochondrial function in that cell. And so if we can repair or heal or improve mitochondrial function in cells, we might be able to reduce people's symptoms, sometimes put symptoms into remission, and at least in some cases, we might be able to induce long-lasting remission of a very serious illness. And the clear example of that is with epilepsy, where people with treatment-resistant epilepsy can do a ketogenic diet for 5 years. It can stop their seizures. But then after 5 years, they can sometimes stop the diet and their seizures never come back, which strongly suggests that their brain actually healed somehow. And I think that's the real hope with this treatment.
Yeah. Yeah. So just making sure I understand that correctly. So the keto diet in some way affects things like mitochondrial biogenesis, or the creation of more mitochondria, and things like mitophagy, where the mitochondria are shutting down. Is that mitophagy, when they're no longer functioning at full capacity? Is that correct for mitophagy?
So mitophagy is the process of getting rid of old or defective mitochondria, and hopefully replacing them with new ones. But so mitochondrial dysfunction is where mitochondria they're not doing what they're supposed to be doing. And that can be due to a variety of reasons. Most often, it's probably due to something called high levels of reactive oxygen species, which can cause inflammation and all sorts of problems. But basically, some mitochondria in our cells can actually just become dysfunctional or suboptimal. And under normal, healthy circumstances, those mitochondria should be kind of destroyed, recycled, so that new healthy ones can take their place. But we know from a tremendous amount of research that people with a variety of chronic mental illnesses, metabolic illnesses, and just plain old aging, that the mitochondria in the cells actually aren't getting recycled. They're not getting replaced. That these malfunctioning or poorly functioning mitochondria can stick around. And then that can cause the cell to begin to malfunction, and that can result in symptoms that we might call mental illness.
Right. So the more we can have kind of the recreation of mitochondria, the healthier the mitochondria are going to be, and the better metabolic health you're going to have.
Yes, that is the theory. And that that is definitely the theory, and that appears to be the case based on numerous lines of research.
Okay. So the next kind of questions that I had for you were things that I was feeling a little bit hazy on in terms of concepts around metabolic health. And one of them was mitochondrial biogenesis. The next was mitophagy. So thank you for explaining those. But another one that I kind of wanted to ask you to explain more about that I just can't quite understand fully is around mitochondrial uncoupling. Can you explain what that is and how that relates to metabolic health and keto and all that stuff?
Yeah, so mitochondrial uncoupling is a process. So mitochondria basically take food and they typically turn it into one of, I guess we could say, three things. There's actually more than three things because I could include reactive oxygen species and other things, but they basically are turning it into one of three things. And the three things that the number one that most people know is they turn food into ATP, which is the energy currency of biological cells. So, and that's why they're called the powerhouse of the cell, because they're making most of the ATP. But another thing that mitochondria do that is critically important is that they take food and not all of it gets turned into energy. Some of it actually gets broken down and used as building blocks for that cell. So it can get broken down, not to its core kind of molecules, but different stages of kind of breakdown. And then those molecules can be used to make proteins or neurotransmitters or cell membranes or other things. So those are the two purposes that most people know. But then when it comes to uncoupling, the other really important process the other thing that mitochondria make from our food is heat. And what's happening is that there are these uncoupling proteins that go into mitochondria, and they basically prevent the process of the electrons flowing through the process to create ATP. And instead, the electrons get used to make heat. And that is how warm-blooded animals are warm-blooded, is that mitochondria ultimately are making the heat in our bodies. And yes, sometimes it's mitochondria in our fat cells, especially brown fat cells. Sometimes it's mitochondria in our muscles, like when we shiver, we might make heat that way. But ultimately, it's actually not the muscle, it's the mitochondria inside the muscle that is creating the heat that we need to live. And so uncoupling uncoupling is complicated because there's a right balance. We don't want to be too hot, we don't want to be too cold. But researchers are looking at the uncoupling process to see if they can understand better, like, could we help people burn some calories through that process to maybe prevent obesity or treat obesity and other things. At the end of the day, I don't have a quick soundbite for is it good or bad? It's all of it. It is essential to human life. We have to have mitochondrial uncoupling in order to create heat, but it needs to be the right balance. It needs to be the right amount to keep our bodies temperature regulated. And fascinatingly, the human body has such an elegant, complex, yet amazingly kind of accurate system for maintaining our body temperature at very specific temperatures, 98.6 for a lot of us. And some people are a little higher, some people are a little lower, but that mitochondria are doing that. Mitochondria are increasing or decreasing heat production as appropriate to maintain our body temperature and keep our bodies functioning optimally.
Right. So I guess just to kind of summarize, all of these processes within the mitochondria are of benefit to our metabolic health and consequently our mental health. And the keto diet is one of the ways that you can work on these or improve these functions within the mitochondria.
The soundbite that I would give for why would the ketogenic diet be helpful is because the ketones can be a rescue fuel source for brain cells that aren't functioning properly because they're not getting enough energy from glucose. We know with a lot of mental health conditions, all the way from Alzheimer's disease to alcohol use disorder to bipolar disorder and schizophrenia, we know that some brain cells just aren't getting enough energy. They don't have enough ATP. And so their mitochondria aren't producing enough energy for those cells to function properly or optimally. And the ketogenic diet, essentially, it doesn't take away glucose because we always, even if you're not eating any sugar, our bodies can produce sugar. The liver will produce sugar, and that will go up to the brain and still be a fuel source for some cells in the brain. But by adding ketones, it adds an extra fuel source so that if the cells are struggling to use glucose, they can keep using some glucose, but they can also get kind of a booster shot or some rocket fuel from ketones. And the hope is that that will help those cells ultimately heal and repair themselves.
Okay, that makes sense. So another thing that I kind of wanted to ask you a little bit about, and you mentioned it earlier in this interview briefly, and you do discuss it in your book, but one thing that I felt was maybe not addressed enough in brain theory, or maybe I didn't understand it enough, was just how the microbiome affects mental illness. I know there's a lot of emerging research right now where it's kind of becoming a hot topic around how the microbiome affects mental health. And so I'm just wondering if you can speak to any new or emerging research about this or how this could be woven into the brain energy theory as well.
So there's no doubt that the gut microbiome plays a role in metabolic health and mental health. And we have evidence suggesting, we don't have clear, unequivocal evidence lined up with clear treatments. So don't go out and just start taking a probiotic and think that that's going to cure your mental illness, because right now all signs are pointing to it's not that simple. But we know that the gut microbiome appears to play a role in autism spectrum disorder, in schizophrenia, in depression, anxiety, even binge eating disorder and other eating disorders. What becomes very complicated very quickly is that a lot of the things that we know play a role in mental illness, like stress and childhood adversity, can actually affect the gut microbiome. And so the gut microbiome sometimes may just be a consequence of risk factors for mental illness. But the gut microbiome is definitely, first and foremost, related to the food we eat and metabolism. So the gut microbes are actually getting first dibs at all of the food that we eat. And in response to that, they create all sorts of hormones and neurotransmitters and neuropeptides and all sorts of things that we know get absorbed into the body, flow up to the brain, affect the brain. And actually, interestingly, 90 to 95% of the serotonin in the human body is actually produced in the gut, either by the gut microbes or by the cells or the nerves lining the gut. So does the gut microbiome directly impact mitochondria? We know for certain that it definitely does in terms of the cells lining the gut. The gut microbes, and again, it gets complicated fast because sometimes it's probably these hormones or neurotransmitters that different microbes are making end up getting into the cells that line the gut, that then affect the mitochondria in those cells, that then affects whether those cells function properly or not. And the bottom line is the gut-brain connection is ridiculously complicated. That's the real answer. It's
Right.
ridiculously complicated. And if you're looking for a really simple answer and a simple solution, we don't have it yet.
Right.
Does the gut microbiome fit into the brain energy theory? Absolutely, 100%. Because we know that a lot of the traditional risk factors for mental health change the gut microbiome, but we also know that when we change the gut microbiome, it does affect metabolism and mitochondrial function, even in brain cells. And that we have reason to believe that that might play a role in anxiety or depression or binge eating or other things.
Right. I guess just like focusing on the types of foods I've been eating on the keto diet, a very heavy fat content and very few like vegetables and, diverse stuff like that. It's hard for me to understand how that could be good for my gut microbiome. So I guess my next question would be, you mentioned briefly that some patients with epilepsy were able to use the ketogenic diet as an intervention to kind of repair cell function and whatnot over a span of 5 years or so. And then they were kind of in remission and were able to go back to a regular diet. And so I'm wondering if that is perhaps a possibility for people who are living with mental illness and treating their mental illness through things like the keto diet as well. Could you perhaps treat it through the keto diet, repair your mitochondria, repair cell functioning and whatnot over a span of time, and then maybe transfer to something that looks a bit more like using intermittent fasting so that you're still getting into ketosis and still having low carb, but really focusing more on, switching between fats and carbs as fuel on a regular basis and getting into that metabolic flexibility, whole foods, unprocessed diet, and all of that kind of thing. Is that an option, or has that been looked into at all yet?
So I will first give you the scientific answer. And the scientific answer is that using the ketogenic diet for mental health conditions is in its infancy. We have very few research studies. We have very few long-term rigorous kind of follow-up studies. So for people who want me to give an answer based on the medical literature, the answer is we don't know yet. Using the anecdotal evidence that I have, I know of literally hundreds of people who years ago, 20 years ago, 10 years ago, whatever, found their way to using the ketogenic diet to improve their mental health. And most of them, not all of them, but most of them have been able to transition off of a ketogenic diet and begin eating a different type of diet. Almost across the board, they cannot go to a standard American junk food diet. If they go to a standard American junk food diet and eat a lot of highly processed foods with sugars and fats and other things, it does not work well for most of them. Symptoms come back, their metabolic health worsens, their mental health worsens. So in that respect, some might say this isn't a long-term cure, because if you were cured, you'd be able to eat that food and be fine. But what I would say is that if those foods are found someday to be toxic to human health, well, that could still be a cure, because you just shouldn't be eating those foods. Nobody should be eating those foods, maybe. But from a practical standpoint, a lot of the people are able to transition to something more like a paleo diet, sometimes even a Mediterranean diet. And different people have different sensitivities, and that's the real answer. Some people just can never seem to add grains back because grains just don't sit well with them. Maybe they're sensitive to gluten, or something about grains is really not good for their system. But I do know people who, for many years, they've tried to transition off the diet, and when they do, their symptoms start coming back, which suggests that they have not achieved permanent healing in some way, but that the ketogenic diet is a really effective treatment for them. And so they just maybe need to stay on the diet in order to get the benefits of it. And that happens in the epilepsy world as well. We know that most people, more than 50%, can stop the diet and maintain all of the benefits that they got from the ketogenic diet, but some people can't. Some people need it for life. There are some people with rare genetic conditions, for instance, who need the ketogenic diet for life if they want to stay seizure free. But the reality is, even if you're one of those people who ultimately can't transition off the diet, it's a lot better to know how to not have seizures or to not have horrible, debilitating mental health symptoms. It's a lot better to at least know, like, hey, there is a treatment option available to me, and if I use it, I can be healthier or feel better or be more functional or productive or whatever benefits people are getting from it. It's good to have that information. More often than not, most people that I know, once they've had more than a year of benefit from the diet, they're not interested in going back. they're not interested in going back to their illness.
Yeah, it's a really common concern that people are bringing it forward to us about, what are the long-term effects of being on this very high-fat diet, and what is it doing for things like your cholesterol or your heart health or your liver health and all that sort of stuff. And, I get that concern, but I'm already starting to feel benefits from being on the keto diet, and it's already feeling like it's worth it to continue on that diet. But it is kind of nice to know also that it might be possible for a lot of people to kind of transition away from the really intense version of medical keto and more toward a more diverse diet that might feel better. So that's nice to know that it could be possible for many people.
Yeah, it's definitely possible. And I think it's the rule, not the exception. I think most people are able to transition away from the diet and start adding more carbohydrates, at least in the form of vegetables and fruits and other things, and maintain all of the benefits.
And what is the time span for that usually like? Like how long do they typically have to be on the keto diet for before things are repaired and they're able to kind of transition their diet a little bit more?
To be honest with you, it's highly individualized.
Right.
And part of it is that I think, different people have different levels of metabolic or mitochondrial compromise. And we know that by the severity of their illness and the severity of their symptoms and other symptoms that they're having. So some people might have schizophrenia and be obese and have diabetes and have high blood pressure. That suggests that they are ill. They are metabolically ill. They've got a lot of signs and symptoms of metabolic compromise. And that person, is going to take longer for that person to heal and recover. The other factor that plays in are medications. And, we in psychiatry prescribe medicines that cause obesity, they cause diabetes, they cause cardiovascular disease. So they cause your cholesterol to get worse, your lipids to get worse. They increase levels of inflammation. And we know that is almost certainly associated with premature mortality. And so if somebody's on 5 of those types of medicines and they start the ketogenic diet, they may need to very slowly, safely, with medical supervision, try to wean off of those medicines, because those medicines may in fact be preventing them from fully recovering. Somebody may come on just one of those medicines, and it may be a medicine that wasn't that harmful to their metabolism, and so they might get a very robust response from the diet. I think it really depends on the person and the circumstances, unfortunately. I wish I could give a clear, easy answer for everyone, but it's just not that simple.
No, that makes sense. And, hearing you talk about how medications can actually be part of the problem and whatnot, it just feels like a really big mind shift that needs to take place in terms of how we approach psychiatric treatment and how we approach kind of this whole mental illness topic in general. And so thank you for being a voice for this alternative treatment that is perhaps very life-changing and I feel a more comfortable way of treating mental illness and a better way of treating mental illness. But thank you so much for being here today and for sharing more information about the keto diet, about metabolic health. It's really great speaking with you about this. So thank you.
Well, thank you, Lauren. And I just want to just really profoundly thank you for being who you are and for being so public with your illness, with the struggles that you've kind of come up against, with your successes and your strength and your resilience and your beautiful life. You are just like a shining example of strength and resilience to so many people. So thank you for being you.
Well, thank you very much. And I'm really hoping that sharing more about how this process is going for me will help other people as well. So thank you for that. Thank you for being here again. Hopefully we can have you on again further down the process of this project to discuss more things as they come up. But yes, thank you for being here. It's great talking with you.
Absolutely.
So another really big thank you to Dr. Chris Palmer for joining us today and going deeper into the science behind using the ketogenic diet as a medical intervention for schizophrenia and what it entails around metabolic health. I'm going to be providing links to our past 2 interviews with Dr. Palmer in the description below, as well as a link to his book, Brain Energy. Thank you so much for watching this video, and as always, wishing you and your loved ones good health. We'll see you in the next one. Bye.